folks. Welcome back to Indaba Conversation. This is Chris once again. Good morning, folks. Welcome back once again to Chris White Africa. This is Chris live in central Pennsylvania. And today's when I probably get a little comeuppance here, sort of amateur here in the broadcasting field, even after all this time. I'm bringing in a Hall of Famer right here, ladies and gentlemen. This is a Hall of Famer journalist and broadcaster, Gail McCabe, known to me for many, many years. I guess I shouldn't say that with a lady on the program. I've known her for many, many years, but quite a famous personality for me as a young man, and she was a young lady then, back in Europe with the American Forces, previously called the Armed Forces Network and the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service. She's been all over, actually interviewed me in the past, so it's nice to turn the tables and get a chance. But if I get corrected on my broadcasting, I'll take it as a lesson learned. Ladies and gentlemen, Gail McCabe, welcome, Gail. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Welcome, and nice to see you again, Chris. And yeah, I'm still young. Let's not go there.
Exactly. No, that's what I said. We were both young man, young woman those days, but not. Yesterday I had Lord Duncan McNair on the program, a former member of the House of Lords in the UK and a tireless human rights campaigner, and he's a few years older than me, and he called me a young man, which is very nice. So I appreciate that. So. Well, Gail, for those who don't know anything about you, let me just run through a few things that I know, and you can flesh it out a little bit. You've got your own company now. Is it CreativeMediaMatters? Is that the correct name for it?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
But for many years, I think you started out in the West Coast, if I'm not mistaken, in music industry. If I'm not mistaken, that's a couple days ago.
Wow. Yeah, you did a real dig back. Yeah, I started in the land of rock and roll. Back in the time when Eddie Van Halen was just getting a start out. We worked with Prince, and we worked with Sheena Easton, The Doors, Little Feat, a number of people. I worked at a place called Sunset Sound and the Sunset Sound Factory, which were some of the premier recording studios in the Hollywood land. And that's where I learned audio. And then I went to Germany.
Well, audio is not a simple thing. As those who try to learn how to broadcast online discover, it takes a bit of effort. You got to get it just right. But so you're on the West Coast. Are you from the West Coast originally, or is that just where you wound up at some point?
Oh, I was raised in Phoenix, Arizona, and then I moved up to California. First, I went up to the Marin County, San Rafael, worked for a music company called Bananas at Large, and which was they were right across the street from the house of the Grateful Dead. And then I moved back down to LA, and in LA, I fell into Sunset Sound and Sunset Sound Factory and started working with them. And I met an engineer called Don Landy, who is probably still renowned as one of the best sound engineers in the business. And he was doing all the work with the Doobie Brothers, with George Harrison. He's renowned for the drum sounds that he always got on his records. And then from there, went to Germany on a vacation. Met my husband, swept me off my feet. He was my waiter.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. Took me out dancing, and I realized that this guy was something special. Went back to LA, had a flea market, sold everything, told my boss I was moving to Germany, and went over and started living with Christopher. And through him is when I first met my first television camera in Grafenwehr, Germany. And if
not exactly a vacation spot.
No, I went from LA to Grafenwehr, and Grafenwehr had one traffic light. Yeah. So it was huge culture shock. But I was able to take my audio and my marketing background, and I started doing volunteer radio interviews at AFN Nuremberg, which was a 45-minute drive down the Autobahn. And then I met a sergeant one day, an NCO in Vilsec, and they had a bunch of TV cameras. And I went over and I started chatting him up. And I said, what is this? What does it do? And he gave me a manual. He let me check out a camera over the weekend. He says, come back and talk to me on Monday. And I drove the whole household crazy that weekend, just going through this manual, going, wow, this is so cool. And I went back and he said, okay, turn it on. I did. He says, give me a white balance. I did. And he says, you now know as much as my soldiers do. I got an extra camera. Go do some video. And I started trying to be like Walter Cronkite. Oh, this is a Spitfire missile.
You got to find your own style, don't you?
Yeah. But that's where I got my start. It was at 7th ATC in Grafenwehr, covering the tank competitions, the border firing, the Boonie troops, community life, and took it from there.
Well, for our audience edification, because my audience is from all over the world, particularly in Africa, the 7th ATC is the 7th Army Training Center, or Command, which is located at Grafenwehr. It's a huge training center in Bavaria, in the southeastern part of Germany. That's where we'd all go for rotations with our combat units to practice war fighting and maneuver. And that way you don't run through neighborhoods and run over people with tanks. You do it actually in the woods. And then Vilsec is the opposite side of that location, which has a base where a U.S. Army brigade is based out of to these days, and was also a training center for classrooms and things like that. So Vilsec and Grafenwehr, same place. Those that served in the U.S. Army in Germany know exactly what we're talking about, and may or may not have fond memories of those two places. I have a mix.
Probably still have the mud on their boots from that area. That's for sure.
It's probably true. If the customs immigration guys didn't check our household goods when they came back. But Gail, that's an interesting start to how you got into this business. But I first saw you. You had already become someone on AFM when I first started seeing you on there. When did you kind of, I don't know, was this a fair way to say, did you catch fire and people began to know who you were there in Germany on AFN?
Well, I started doing the coverage for the 7th ATC, and then I had a job offer down in Stuttgart working with 7th Corps, and that was doing their sports coverage, of which I knew nothing. And I quickly caught on that if you go and you hang out with the audience and you talk to them, they're going to let you know what the boxer should be doing, or what the track champ, who the track champ could be, or what to keep your focus on. And so between them and an older gentleman at AFN Europe, Milt Fitzwater, Gary Bartel, Charlie Gill, they kind of gave me some learning lessons, and I started covering the sports. And then when Desert Storm came along, I went to General Fred Franks and his boss, the colonel I was working for, and I said, "Sir, I can do a whole lot more." And he let me go over to Saudi Arabia, to the ports of Dhahran, where they were offloading for Desert Storm. And I stayed with them for, 4 weeks, I think it was. And I came back right before Christmas, got my stories out on this is what the troops are doing. And then I got back over there in, I think it was right at the end of January, first part of February, right after they had all the tank campaigns. Went into Safwan, saw the humanitarian efforts that the soldiers were doing. Went to KKMC in Saudi Arabia. It was King Khalid military city.
That's correct.
And saw where they set up the first Frosties. If you remember the Frosties, that's where they served. They set up, and they thought it was a morale builder that soldiers needed to have something from a taste from home, get them away from the MREs. And so they set up a place where they could go and get free hamburgers and milkshakes.
No, I didn't experience it. That was I was actually out in the dirt. So, but I did.
Yeah.
I did go KKMC in some of my roles as a Class A agent, which is the person that carries the cash for my audience, and a field ordering officer to purchase things locally. But no, I've been to KKMC, but I lived in the dust out there, so I never saw those Frosty stands.
Yeah, but in that process, I started going to a professional organization called the NPPA, the National Press Photographers Association, and they have a video workshop. And I went there, and through that process, I have learned how to actually get in and tell a story. That's how I learned that while we watch with our eyes, we see with our ears before we see with our eyes. So the sound is so critical, and how to edit with pacing, how to edit with color, how to bend your knees, get different angles, how to let the people tell the story. And so I started making a name for myself, getting stories out from the desert. And then I went back, and of course, that was simultaneously the time when 7th Corps stood down. They deactivated them. And I got a call one day on the phone from this very Irish-sounding gentleman. And he says, "You Gail McCabe?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "I'm General Flynn of the 21st TACOM. Do you know who that is?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." And he said, "Well, that's the logistics command. We're based in Kaiserslautern, and you're going to come work for me because I want my 21st TACOM to get on the news." And so I moved from Stuttgart to Kaiserslautern, otherwise known as Little America.
K-Town.
Started working out at AFN and went all around Europe and learned so much about logistics. And you can only fight if you have bullets, and how do you get the bullets to the soldier? How do you get the food there? And that was a fascinating career. And then from there, I had a fellowship at CNN in Atlanta. I was the first civilian broadcaster to have a chance to go to CNN headquarters. And I was there for 4 months, actually got on the air, started doing feature things. They wouldn't let me on the newsroom because I worked for the military and I probably was going to sell secrets or something. It was really bizarre. But that was before CNN sold out to AOL Time Warner, and they were still doing the news back then. And I told my husband, I said, we had to move to Atlanta because I'm sold. I want to do this hardcore news coverage with CNN. And it took him 5 years to get the government job because I also told him that CNN doesn't pay, so you're going to have to support us. And so by the time we got here, they'd merged with AOL. They kind of let me know I wasn't young and perky enough. And yeah.
I'm sure that was a pleasant conversation.
Yeah. And then the Army reached out and said, we like what you do. Come stay work with us. You can work out of Atlanta. And so I started working with Soldiers Radio and Television, which at that point in time was the premier news magazine for the military channel. And they sent me all over the place. Yeah, it was a fascinating career, absolutely fascinating. I think I've been in 66 countries since then.
I was going to say you must be approaching close to 70. That's my figure, up around 70 countries. But I wasn't doing it as a journalist. I was doing it in other capacities. It would have been interesting as a journalist, an opportunity. But you know, you've been all these places, and you've had access to some of the biggest names that people may have heard of in the public. I mean, you talk about general officers, you've interviewed ambassadors, you've been all over the world. Who amongst some of these people might have been perhaps the most fascinating interview you've ever done? Anyone come to mind?
Oh, gosh, there was a General Schreier. I'm going to mess up his name. He was the chief of staff for the Afghan military. Fascinating man, because he was a prisoner of war for the Taliban before the U.S. came in, and he was released. And then he was chosen to take over the startup of the Afghan National Army. Fascinating man. General Karimi. Of course, General Petraeus. General Petraeus has always impressed me with how much he knows and how much he knows to ask about, which is pretty cool. Let's see, I've done, I went to the Atlanta Motor Speedway and did a story on the drag racer that was representing the Army, Tony, and again, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting last names. But yeah, I've seen some pretty interesting people. I actually got to talk to the vice president of Slovenia right after the fall of the wall. That was pretty cool.
That would be very interesting. I remember back in those days, I was based in Hanau when that happened, and in Gelnhausen, then Hanau. So when you would have spoke to him, it was before I was in Hanau. But when we were looking at the Balkans, I was warning people when Slovenia and Croatia started making noise after we came back from Saudi Arabia that they're going to declare independence. I said, we might want to pay attention to this. Just be quiet, Wyatt. We're just deactivating it. We don't have time for that stuff. Just clear out the arms rooms, turn in the ComSec, and we're gonna PCS and move everybody around to new locations, permanent change station. And I warned people. I said, hey, guys, pay attention. And eventually we wound up in that mess there. But Slovenia must have been fascinating. It was a 9-day conflict in Slovenia, and the Yugoslav National Army pulled out pretty fast. They pretty much said, there are almost no Serbs here. It's not of strategic importance to us. We're going to focus on the Krajina and on eastern Croatia. But that must have been a fascinating thing. Did you go to Slovenia to interview him, or did you meet him in another location?
Oh, no, I was in Slovenia. This was after that conflict, and they were trying to set themselves up as an established nation of the former East Bloc. Mm-hmm. And so the Logistics Command had set up a training exercise with them to teach them how to defuse leftover bombs that had been behind from World War II and from other previous conflicts. And so I spent, I think, a good 10 days there traveling around, come to find out that to this day, right off of in the waters between Slovenia and Italy, there are still some bombs there from battleships and submarines from World War II to this day. And every once in a while, they'll track one as they go across the ferry lines. But, fortunately, nothing's blown up. Nobody's been hurt. And then before that, of course, I was following the Bosnia conflict. And oh man, that was so cold. Of course, it was January. We were traveling from Germany down through Croatia, down into Serbia, down into Bosnia. And we ended up staying at the ice rink. I think it was the ice skating stadium that they had used for the Olympics about 5 or 6 years previous. And it was filled with the British, it was filled with the Americans, it was filled with some of the local forces that were helping out. And that was amazing. That was a maybe. That was Sarajevo, and that city was demolished. It was it was very sad.
It was an incredible tragedy, an absolute tragedy. I mean, you think back, 1984, there was an incredible Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. It was quite.
Is that what it
else.
was?
It was 84, yes. I'm a huge Winter Olympics fan, although not so much this year, but normally I am. but yeah, well, my first Olympics of memory that sinks in my, of course, I remember as a little kid, Munich, but it was just kind of there. But my first one for me was Montreal, and then for the Summer Olympics, and then Innsbruck. And by the way, don't tell anybody, but I'm still in love with Dorothy Hamill. I still have a crush on her. So.
She's a classy lady.
Oh, she's brilliant. And she's had an amazing life. Unfortunately, with the not the ice capades. Is that what she had? She had something like that. They've gone bankrupt a few times, but she's still an amazing lady. Quite a graceful and incredible skater too. And anyway, but I digress. Stop with the crush there. So 84 was the Olympics, and then just a few years after that, the whole thing falls apart. Which many people predicted 1980 when Tito died, but it didn't happen in 80. It took a bit longer for this to happen and the end of the Cold War. But you're right, Sarajevo, what a tragedy. I spent a lot of time in Sarajevo during the conflict, and it had been a place of quite a bit of beauty and prosperous. 2 out of 3 marriages were interethnic between Bosniaks and Serbs and Muslims, and then everyone turned on each other because politicians. It was really, really sad thing. So you did a lot of coverage then, I take it, of Bosnia. Did you do multiple trips down there, or did you just get the one trip in?
Oh, no, multiple trips. When they first opened the Sava Bridge going across, I was there capturing some of the first trucks, the first traffic coming in. I was there when, oh gosh, and here I'm proving my age with the memory. The general who had gone down, I think it was with the 1st Armored Division.
General Granger?
And he was not Granger, possibly after, but he had set up camp in Tuzla.
Yes.
And I was doing the story on the convoy that was coming down. So I rode with him on that convoy all the way down. We got in like 3:00 in the morning, and we all got taken to task because we drove the road that passed in front of the headquarters where the general was sleeping. And so that was like,
no, that wouldn't have been Granger.
Really?
Granger wouldn't have taken a task for that. He just liked to mess with the other guys. He's the guy that at the bridge at Birchko, when they brought protesters up and the Serbs were trying to provoke a confrontation.
Oh yeah.
So he took his scout platoon, which was there with their Bradleys fighting vehicles, and just took them off the bridge. And then the protesters showed up and they're like, what do we do now? We were trying to start trouble, and there's no trouble. And then he topped it off by taking Apache helicopters and flying over the headquarters of militia leaders, and at nighttime, harassing them with Apache helicopters. Yeah, that was General Granger. So I don't think he would have been the one complaining about you driving by. That would be out of character for him. The Balkans were pretty crazy stuff. But I mean, you've been to so many places. I mean, look, let's go back. Let's play the hits here. Okay, so we were in Germany in the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. Then the transition to the New World. I don't want to say New World Order. That's a term that's fallen on bad terms. But the transition from a bipolar world to for a period, a unipolar world, and all the machinations, Rwanda, the Balkans, all the things that happened. Then we go into the Second Gulf conflict at the beginning of the new century. And we go beyond that, this global war on terrorism, Afghanistan, the Philippines, all over the place. And you've seen all this change. Back in the day when we're talking about here, people always ask me about having been stationed in Europe. And I tell them, I said, of course, my first tour was enlisted in the early 80s. And then I came back as an officer on my second tour, and then as a lieutenant and captain, and then eventually as a lieutenant colonel. I served in Stuttgart. But in those early days, when 1990 hit us, there were 287,000 active duty U.S. Army soldiers in West Germany. There were 160,000 U.S. Air Force personnel. There were a few thousand Marines and Navy sprinkled at commands and places like that. And there were, in total, 1 million American citizens carrying Department of Defense identification cards between family members, civilian contractors, civilian workers, and military personnel. That was out of a population of 62 million. So you had 1 million Americans living in West Germany. And a lot of people don't understand the scope and the influence that, well, they were also Brits and lots of other people, but just how pervasive Americans were. We had our own gasoline stations, petrol stations on the Autobahns. We had our own broadcasting, multiple high schools, 9 different hospitals, not clinics, hospitals around Germany. The scope of what that was then compared to what it is today, with less than 30,000 U.S. troops in West Germany and probably, I don't know, maybe 100,000 total when you take family members and contractors and such. It's very different today. And I suppose that's probably a good development geostrategically, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's a whole different world, isn't it? I mean, they used to say, bigger than Stuttgart, and that meant something. That's because there were 32,000 troops stationed in and around Stuttgart. That's not the case today. It's a little different than back in the day, isn't it?
Yeah, when we first started out at AFN in Europe, most of the Germans were learning their English by listening to AFN Europe because that was our shadow audience. That was before the days of cable. And so we were using radio waves to get the message out. When I worked at 7th Corps, I was covering 12 military communities across the southern half of Germany. Everything from Garmisch to Bad Tolz to Neu-Ulm, Stuttgart, Heilbronn, Berchtesgaden, which is a very magic place, Berchtesgaden.
Indeed.
I love that. And then you raised the issue of Goma Zaire. I was there in 94 when the Americans went in from the logistics command to make the clean water for the folks on Goma Zaire. And I think that was the first time I ever had somebody actually point a gun at me. And that was interesting, left a mark. Yeah. But we did a lot of good. We probably did some stupid stuff, but we did a lot of good. We really did. And it's interesting to see now how the footprint is shrinking. Probably is a good thing because, again, and I don't want to go there. That's policy and programs and stuff like that. But these other nations are grown up enough now that they need to probably shoulder some of the burden, I would think. But that's another world. And then we got into Iraq. That was fun.
Wow, that's one description for it.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time in Iraq. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I think one of more interesting stories was when I went to Indonesia with a medical mission. It was a humanitarian mission to go and set up one of those hearts and minds missions where they provide basic medical clinic stuff to the villagers out in the remote areas, do some training for the National Guard in the process and the reservists. And we had one lady once who was a midwife, and she says, "You're going with me." And I said, okay. And we got in the car and we drove to this little village up a windy path at the top of a mountain. And we walked into this room, and there must have been 25 women there. And they had one girl who was laid out on a medical bed, and they said, they told the midwife, they said, "We need you to give her a UID." And so that was probably one of my more challenging shoots, is how do you artfully shoot somebody in a gynecological exam without giving away the goods, so to speak. But it was fascinating. I thought these women would be very remote and probably uneducated, and they were some of the smartest women I think I've ever encountered. They were talking to us about birth fatalities, mortalities. They were talking to us about health conditions in the village, about how they made their income. Some of them were studying chemistry and physics in this little village. I mean, it was eye-opening for me. It was very, very eye-opening. And it was kind of neat to see.
No doubt. That's for me, Gail. That's been one of the most fascinating aspects of my career. People ask me why I stayed in the Army so long. It certainly wasn't for the pay, although I made a fair wage towards the end, but it certainly wasn't become wealthy. I could have done that many other ways, but it was because I enjoyed serving the nation. I truly believe in our Constitution, and I could see the impact of what we do, whether it was deterrence in the Cold War, preventing a conflict wholly from happening, or it was humanitarian assistance when a tsunami or forest fires or something like that happens. And also, for me, particularly gratifying was being in Africa with the mill-to-mill missions and the veterinary exercises and the dental exercise we do and things like that, working with partners. And one of the most, I'd say, honestly, most fulfilling things for me was peace resolution and then teaching respect for human rights. That was pretty incredible. I got to do that all across Africa and inculcate that. And it was very fulfilling. And to this day, I think you're aware that I was the person that was there for the main portion of the restructuring and rebuilding the armed forces of Liberia. And they have, I would argue, been a force for good since we left there. And that's a credit to them. I'm not taking any credit for that. But people asked me when I was in Liberia, they said to me at the time, they said, so Colonel Wyatt, let's look ahead 10 years down the road, which I think is always a good question for a journalist to ask you. Because I always interact with the media there trying to help, because their media was trying to get restarted after the conflict. So I'd be interviewing, and they said, well, 10 years down the road, what are your thoughts would be with this army if something bad happens? I said, well, honestly, all we can do is help our partners and show them the way that we do it. And if that's the standard they want to live by, it's something they can adopt. And that's what they've said. So we're doing that now. And they seem to be accepting it. And it's becoming part of their ethos. But if there's a conflict here and the Army misbehaves, the Armed Forces of Liberia 10 years down the road, I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep. And the journalist looked at me and said, well, you're not going to, why not? What, you won't be disturbed? I said, well, of course, misdeeds will bother me, but I have to be honest. When they come and do the war crimes trial, I don't have anything to worry about, because all the ammunition boxes say Lieutenant Commander Dan Honkin, American Embassy, Mamba Point. My name isn't on any of the ammunition or the artillery rounds. Anyway.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
No, well, he laughed.
Okay.
It was kind of light in a moment there, but there's some nice comments in the chat here. People saying that this lady is fascinating. Well, she is. That's why I asked her to come on. So,
gosh.
Yeah. Plus, I want to turn the tables. I get to ask you, but go ahead. What are you saying? Remember, go ahead.
Well, remember when we first met back in the days of AFRICOM, when AFRICOM had first stood up, and I met you when you were in Botswana.
Yep.
And I coerced you into teaching some sort of leadership class so I could capture some B-roll in the background of the Botswanian army.
Yeah, but trust me, there wasn't much coercion there. I may have made it look that way.
But what's really fascinating there in Botswana is that at that time, Africa had huge problems with HIV/AIDS. And Botswana, I believe at the time, was the number 2 country in the world for HIV/AIDS. And it was the military that had taken on the campaign to try and educate the population on what they could do to, safe sex, get circumcisions, get the drugs, the antiviral drugs going, to get tested. And that was fascinating. They had an incredible campaign. I mean, beautiful videos that they put out on the national television. They were spokesmen. Whereas you go into many other countries, to include ours, people are a little bit hesitant to talk about a disease like that. So that was fascinating. I was stunned.
Well, in fact, and I took you to Bella Pele, which was a non-governmental organization, ironically started by USAID, the U.S. Agency for National Development, and Peace Corps volunteers. When they first came back to Botswana in the early part of this century, they got together. They came up with this concept because at that time, because you came about a decade later, you and I were in Botswana a decade later, this had been building up for a while. I've been the analyst that covered Botswana, so I know the story and was actually involved in it. But what happened is that at that time in 2000, admitting that you had HIV was not something you did. Stigma was off the charts. And you didn't go get tested, because the only people who get tested are people who have HIV, right? I mean, that was the logic. And so it was a real problem. And so what they did is they came up with this concept of anonymous testing, where people can just come and no one knows about it. It's free. They'll give you advice. If you test positive, they'll give you recommendations where to go for treatment and the right things to do, and also let you know you have a moral responsibility to inform your partners so that you can protect your partners. Anyway, so that's how it got started. And then the Department of Defense, my predecessors, got us involved in the activity by using humanitarian assistance money, which for my audience is money that Congress allocates to the military each year. So we do it from an altruistic standpoint, but let's be honest, it's from a strategic standpoint. When we give money and assistance to rebuild schools and clinics, to fix roads and wells, to build HIV clinics, that is number one, so that we look good and we're helping people. That's what it's about. So we have a soft face in what we're doing, and it's legitimate, it's genuine, but it's also to give us access. Because of those activities, we'll get to know community leaders and business leaders, so that if we have to interact, we have access. People know who we are. We're not just some off in the embassy sort of organization. Anyway, so we got involved in this and we started building these clinics. And we went to one of those clinics in Habaroni, and that was a fascinating day. The guy's name was Tabiso. I'll never forget that. You interviewed him. Now, I didn't see this part because I had gone there with you, and then I left and you let you do your business as a journalist. And then I got to see it when the video was produced. The Promise of AFRICOM was the program we're talking about, was the title. And I saw that, you had Tabiso. He was all confident before he had said, yes, no, I've got a girl and she's promising to marry me. Yes, she's promising. I still laugh at that, the way he said it, because he chuckled. And you're like, Gail's like, he seems confident. He's fine. And then 15 minutes later, the results are in, and he's like sweating and wiping his brow. And you did a fantastic job narrating the video in the background. As you said, audio makes all the difference in the world. You can hear him, but you can also hear your comments, and it's just perfect timing. And fortunately, of course, the young man was negative, which is, obviously we probably wouldn't have shown that if he'd been positive, but still, that was very generous of him to volunteer to do that with you. Because he could have had, life-altering news that day. What was that like for you that day at Tabela Pele? Was it an interesting experience? I suspect it was.
It's always interesting when you're asking people to step forward and to share or to divulge personal information. Most people, if you are respectful and if you ask nicely, they'll tell you, yeah, it's okay, and sometimes I'll say, hey, I'll let you see what I got, and you tell me if you're comfortable with that. That kind of courtesy carries you through a lot of different campaigns and conditions. It's the mutual respect that you show for another human being and understanding their culture and the situation that they're living their life in. You and I have both discovered over our careers that if you are respectful of someone else's culture and their beliefs, you can get so far and you can get so much accomplished if you just recognize that as Americans, we're not the only voice in the world. And it makes a huge difference. It served me well in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I knew I had to get my footage. I had to capture what was going on, but the women especially don't like to have their faces on camera, and they would throw their hands up or throw rocks at you or spit on you. But if you established a little eye contact first and just kind of, is this okay? And they would either say no or they would say okay. If you focused on their children, that was cool, because they're very, very proud of their children. And culture is a big thing. We found that recently in my new career, since I retired, I've been doing a lot of work with global health. And I had the great opportunity to go to West Africa with the director of CDC, Center for Global Health. And we retraced the path of Ebola and some of the programs that have been put in place to see if public health programs are improving in these countries. And very humbling, very fascinating to realize that while we think about things as being austere and rural, when you get into places like Sierra Leone or Guinea and even Liberia, their concept of impoverished and poor takes on incredible depth and goes many, many more levels down. And you'll have places where Ebola, or because of the politics, Ebola didn't get tapped down or caught. And in the process, they lost 2 generations of education for their population. And so culture is fascinating. Very much so.
Absolutely. One of my master's programs, one of my focus areas was cultural anthropology, a big part of what I did in the master's program. So I appreciate that a whole lot. Folks, you're listening to Chris White Africa on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcast Network. My special feature guest today is none other than Department of Defense Hall of Fame journalist, Gail McCabe. make you blush a little bit there. So it's a well-deserved honor. I'm glad to see you got that. It's about 7 years ago, or 6 or 7 years ago, I think that they gave you that honor. Is that correct?
It was, 2016, I think it was.
Okay,
2015,
2015,
2016, something like
2016.
that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was the year after I retired. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome stuff. You talk about culture and importance, but honestly, let's just go a slightly different direction here. We're talking about journalism. One of the frustrations for me that's developed since the end of the Cold War, if we go back to the Cold War, for decades, news outlets, especially newspapers, would have journalists based all over the globe in many capitals, and it had people that knew the area that could get on the ground and make quick contact. But a lot of that has gone away. Like, for instance, in Africa, virtually the only place that we find journalists permanently stationed that cover the continent are in Johannesburg or Nairobi, and they cover the entire continent from there. That makes for a very difficult situation. Let me give an example. Now, the reason I mention this, Gail, is because you traveled all over the world. The Department of Defense took you everywhere to cover news and find news and cover stories. And I think a lot of that's in some degree missing in today's world when we talk about news. So when we used to have these journalists everywhere, you could see. I think we saw, in my view, some better coverage. When the Paris shootings occurred a few years ago, the terrorist attack occurred in Paris. The major networks scrambled to get their anchors to France, and so we had this gap of coverage for almost 18 hours. And I thought that was inexcusable. Don't you have a stringer on the ground in Paris that it works for you? Fox, MSNBC, CNN? I mean, can't you turn to someone? And the answer is no in many cases, And the Paris may not be the best example, but I just use it as an example to show you how poignant it is. It's a bit disconcerting for me. And is the role of the journalist and the photojournalist who travels the world, is that diminishing? Because I don't think the need for it's diminishing. I think the need for it is grown exponentially to cover world events. But where do you see the state of that in today's world?
Okay, well, let's get down to the basics. Let's define journalism.
Okay.
A lot of what we see these days, where a lot of us go for our immediate news and feedback is social media.
True.
It's going to be on Twitter. It's going to be on Facebook. It's going to be on YouTube. And Lord help us, many of those folks are giving us the blow by blow as it's happening. But what they're forgetting to give us is the context. Mm-hmm. Why is it happening? How long has it been happening? When, where, who? All those basic, the 5 journalism tenets that you go forward with when you ask your stories. And we don't get a lot of that. And a lot of the stories that we need to hear from overseas are embedded in the culture and the background and the history that takes place that leads up to it. And if we don't hear about that, then we don't fully understand. And we make these very quick judgmental decisions on what should be done or what could be done, or why aren't they doing this, or why are they doing this? Maybe the audience doesn't understand that there are tribal implications. Maybe they don't understand that the women don't step forward because out of fear of pain of death, something like that. So, you got to get into journalism. And I think that when the military forces and the State Department forces started downsizing and pulling people back in, a lot of the news bureaus started pulling back in. It's money. Yes. It gets down to, the money. And then alongside that, it gets down into the viewing appetite of the U.S. audience. Most of us don't want to know about anything beyond our county, our city boundaries. If it doesn't impact us right here, right now, by putting food on our table, we're not interested. And that's the shame, because we are all tightly interconnected. And if we don't get that, shame on us.
Well, I agree 100%. The reason I raised that is because I think it's an apropos topic, but a couple examples come to mind of American journalists who, because of their knowledge of a situation, exposed things to the world, either as a journalist directly and then later as an author. And one that comes to mind is William Schreier, of course, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He was based in Berlin for many years as Germany descended into what it was going into for the Second World War, and then afterwards wrote an amazing book. But he wrote for years on it and kept people informed from Germany, and he was a reporter for a U.S.-based publication. And then there's Januaris McGahan, who is from Perry County, Ohio, known as the liberator of Bulgaria, who used to write for the New York, I think it was the Times or one of the other New York papers, and exposing what was happening in the Balkans and in Bulgaria back under the Austro-Hungarian Empire time frame, the Russian Empire. And so he's known colloquially as the liberator of Bulgaria, an American journalist in Bulgaria, which is interesting. It's a very different time when that sort of thing is happening. And I think you hit it right, who, what, when, where, why, how. I find myself, no matter what the media source is these days, and any of them. I mean, I used to be religiously devoted to reading The Economist, and then about 20 years ago began to question a lot of things I was reading there. Not that I didn't question before, but I found myself more often in conflict with what I was reading. And what we get an awful lot of is op-ed disguised as news, opinion, not news. And we see this all the time, even on what's supposed to be a news article. People, I just read today, reading something where adjectives are used that I think are highly inappropriate for a news story. It should be the news, not trying to make the news. It's a bit frustrating, but I find myself picking apart everything I read, going, okay, you got to ask this question. All right, so let me accept that you're reporting this person did that, but why? Why would they do that? It doesn't make any sense. Or, okay, what's their motivation? What's behind that? And I think that you've kind of touched on that. A journalist asks those questions. They think about those questions. They anticipate those things. And if you don't, you're just a talking head. That would be my take on it.
Which brings us back into today's news coverage, which is virtually, let's go from a talking head to a talking head to a talking head. And these are folks that are educated, they're well-versed, they read a lot, but they perhaps have not actually had their feet on the ground. And I cannot stress how much of a difference that makes when you're trying to give some coverage, some context to something. The good and the bad about today's video coverage, today's news coverage, is everything needs to be 59 seconds or less so it can hit the social media play. But in that process, it's really, really hard to do anything more than just touch and go. And people they're getting the headlines, they're getting maybe a little snippet of information, but they're not understanding why that snippet of information is so critical in these, in the public health. Well, no, let's go back to Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, our troops did huge amount of good programs that we never heard about in helping the local population understand why education is good for everybody, why healthcare is good for everybody, why it's a good idea for you to elect your own leader, and to understand that all of these aspects come together that give you a strong economy, which gives you a strong nation, which gives you a voice on the world stage. And they did a lot in those aspects, and a lot of the people heard them. But I ran into a number of national media reporters on the ground, and I would ask them, why don't you cover this school that got opened up and the soldiers are giving away backpacks and books, and they're teaching people how to, do math, simple math, or read Arabic or read English or Pashtun or Dari. And they would say that our producers have told us back in the States that the American public's not interested because if it's not babies, bombs, and bullets, they're not interested. And I say, shame on us. We need to know.
Well, I absolutely agree, and that's the frustrating thing, and I disagree with you. I mean, I appreciate the bottom line. I mean, news businesses should be in business to accomplish some things as the fourth estate, but turning a profit so you can be a going concern is important. I understand that. But I think people are hungry for good news stories. I do good news stories. They're hard to find sometimes, but I do good news stories. Particularly, folks try to get good ones on Africa, and I find that people do enjoy them because the doom and gloom gets tiring at some point, and people just tune out the news. But what you've touched on here really is one of the most distressing things for me, and that's, it used to be back in the day, no one reads below the fold for newspapers. It's just the headline. But now it's no one goes past 30 seconds on the tweet or the video on Twitter, or no one goes past a minute for the news broadcast. It's a bit frustrating because it's a highly complex, highly complicated world. And in some respects, social media is while it's eroded a degree of sovereignty from sovereign actors like states, but not exclusively states, it's also been a democratization of ideas. Unfortunately, that democratization has led to garbage in, garbage out as well. And so you really have to learn how to have a filter, and you have to be a critical thinker to understand what you're reading and judge for yourself. In my program, Gail, people come on. I have a lot of people that really enjoy my approach, some that don't like me at all, some that attack me, and that's fine. You can't make everybody happy. But when people start to say, yeah, Chris is right, he's my source for news, and I said, well, that's great. I appreciate support. Be sure to smash the like button, and we appreciate that. Become a subscriber. But at the same time, you should go read for yourself. That's why I mentioned my sources, and then I mentioned what I believe their slant or angle is, and this is my view on it. And you judge for yourself. You have to make that decision for yourself. And there seems to be a dearth of that amongst a huge segment of the population, not just of America, but of the world, in analyzing or making your own judgment. People oftentimes believe what they hear and see implicitly, and I think it's a little disconcerting for me. I don't know your thoughts on that.
It is. I have members of my own family that believe that because they read it on YouTube or saw it on Facebook, it's true. If it's Twitter headline, it's true. And they're going to go with it, and they're not going to question it. They're not going to ask any more questions because they saw it on the internet. And so therefore it is true. And, but I've always been someone who's asked why. Yeah. My husband calls me the Wonder Woman because I'm always wondering why. Yeah. Drives him nuts after a while.
Another lovely, graceful lady. That's Linda Gray. She was Wonder Woman. Was it Linda Gray? No, what's her name? Linda. No. Oh,
it was God. Linda.
It was Linda.
I remember it was Linda.
Linda Gray's the other one. She was from Battlestar Galactica. No, but anyway, yeah. So Linda Carter.
Yeah, there you go.
Another graceful lady. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Yeah,
but the Wonder Woman. That's awesome. I love that description.
Yeah, but I would like to think positively that we're going to do full circle, and that the younger generation is going to come forward. They're going to use social media and the internet, and they're going to start bringing forth a little bit more of the big picture. I've done a lot of media training with the military since I retired and even before I retired. And the one thing I was pushing is that you're going to go tell that single person story. But in that single person story, you need to back out at some point and embrace the bigger picture. How does that story fit into the bigger picture? And quite frankly, why should we care? And that's what I tell my clients today when they ask me to do videos. Sure, that's a great idea. It's a wonderful subject. But bottom line, your viewer wants to know, why should they care? Why should they watch? And we need to bring it home all the time. What's the point? What am I going to get out of it? And how can I make a difference? Why should I make a difference? And I think that's the role of the news. I really, really do.
Well, I can't disagree with that at all. That's kind of the philosophy I take. It's the so what. It's as an intelligence officer, people are like, well, this is happening. So I'm like, yeah, okay, and what does that mean? What's the impact of that? What's that going to result in? What's the end state? Where are we going? What's going to happen? How does this fit into the bigger picture? And that's so for me, the journalistic angle is almost a natural approach because I'm kind of inquisitive. I'm not Wonder Woman, but I'm inquisitive like you are. So, but I mean, it's example of that is the story I did for the Macadamia Nut Association. Now I reached out to I was looking for good news stories to talk about South Africa because so many gruesome stories were coming out, and I didn't want to exhaust people because I pick and choose what news stories I report each day on Africa and around the globe. And I try to pick timely ones, also ones that are neglected. Like I'll frequently go back to Myanmar and the military coup there to remind people what's happening there, which is not getting news coverage. I'll talk about Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique and things like that people aren't covering. But there's a lot of gruesome stuff. So I decided that, among other things, I wanted to check into macadamia nuts because I read somewhere that South Africa had a growing industry. I did the research on it, found it. In fact, it is the world's largest exporter of macadamia nuts now, which is great for South Africa's hard currency coming in. But also a little further research in the industry, I found that many of the new farmers are actually non-traditional farmers. They're women and majority Black South Africans, which is an interesting story. It's diversifying the farming sector. And then there's also the angle that there's a lot of theft. People steal a lot of them, and that also plays in. And so all that plays a role into the crime situation, into diversification of agriculture, and also it all fit, and it's a bigger picture here. And then, of course, the CEO is a lady. And so, that was interesting too. And so I brought all together and explained to people, why should you care? Well, this is a growing growing sector. There's opportunity here for South Africans of all stripes, and there's money to be made here. You're the world's largest exporter, but domestic consumption is low. That's something anyway. So it's bringing it all together, and that's kind of the approach I take with when I do those sorts of things. And I think that if you do that correctly, you grab the viewer or the listener, and they want to hear what's going to be said, and they can judge for themselves where it's going.
Okay, I got a story for you,
Okay,
one that you can get into in the future, and it's called the STOP program, Stop Transmission of Polio. And this is a program that's funded by CDC, USAID, I think State Department, and then some of the national governments also get involved. It's all, the workforce are volunteers, people that have some training in public health or in medical, and they get onto the field and they get into parts of the country where they don't have the medical trained workforce to get into the country, but their whole purpose is to educate people on polio, which still exists, get your children vaccinated, and they collect the data and stuff like that. And it's fascinating because there are still some 12 countries out there where they have huge polio problems that are, the Philippines has a really, really bad polio problem right now. I think Uganda has got a bad polio problem. And polio is something that keeps remerging. It's around. And if you don't get vaccinated at a youthful age, you're going to paralyzed. You're going to die. So that's a good program for you, to talk to one of those volunteers and find out why they do it and how they get involved.
Absolutely, that'd be a fantastic topic to talk about. You know, and it's the polio is a heartbreaking one because we nearly eradicated it in the wild. Mm-hmm. Almost had it wiped out. The only disease technically we've ever wiped out in the wild, of course, has been smallpox, but it's not really wiped out. It sits in freezers in Atlanta at the CDC, and and in Maryland at the Army's USAMRIID. So it's up. You got company in the background.
Yeah, husband and the dog. Yeah,
I see that. We
checking to see what's going on.
Little photo bombing going on there.
Hi, Tyler.
Dog looks happy. But so we knew. So polio nearly, smallpox technically wiped out in the wild, but it still exists. And also, they've cultured smallpox from cadavers dug up in the permafrost in Siberia, who died a century ago, and they were able to resuscitate that stuff. So it's not technically gone, but it's under control. Smallpox, thank goodness. And polio was the next one that the World Health Organization was looking forward to eradicating. We're so close. And then they blame the resurgence of it on a trip for the Hajj that took place and brought it from Nigeria, they claim. But whatever the case is, it's a really nasty disease, and it's really heart-wrenching to see anybody suffer from it because it's such a simple way to avoid it. Back when they first came out with polio vaccines, you got that big scar on your arm. And back in the early days, some people actually got it because there was a live version of it when they first started this. And so they got polio as a consequence of it. But these days, it's an oral polio vaccine. It's, it's safe. And, so it's really sad to see anybody get it when it's entirely preventable. And that's a great story. So maybe you can put me in touch with someone there and I could get them on the program. That'd be fantastic.
I can do that. That would be a good one for you. But there's a lot of good stories out there. Back in again to Afghanistan, I spent 17 trips in and out of Afghanistan, so I have a lot of history through there. But I think it was in 2006, the ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, had set up a program called Afghan First, and the whole point of it was to bring women out and make them equal partners. And so they would provide funding for entrepreneurs that would set up businesses, and they had to have a woman on the board or a woman owned. They had to employ so much percentage of the workforce as women. And the one that I covered was a sewing factory that they had set up, and they brought women in, and the idea was they would make things initially for the Afghan military. So they made socks, they made underwear, they made tents, sheets, uniforms, you name it, they made it. And then the idea is that as things calm down, these skills would then be transferred into making things for the local economy so that the business would survive. They found out when they got into this that many of these women they brought in had no education at all. And they didn't know how to use a tape measure. They didn't know how to do math. They didn't know how to sew. And so they brought them in. They gave them some basic skills. Then they found out that the only way that the women would be allowed to come into work according to the men in the family, because the men were in charge, was if they brought their children with them. So in the process, they set up a little daycare for the kids, and the kids got a little education in the process. And it was a wonderful program. The women made some money. They were able to buy some extra stuff for the home. The self-confidence that you saw being exuded by these women was just awesome. And the children were learning things. They were getting healthy foods during the day. They were getting a little bit of education. They would have doctors come in and do clinic checks, offer vaccinations and inoculations as needed. And it was a very, very positive, progressive program. And that was good to see. Didn't last very long. The funding got cut off, which was kind of a shame, but it made some serious progress while it was alive.
That's, I suppose, one of the most frustrating things, and for me in Africa, I've always looked at whatever we're doing. Can it be sustainable? Will someone be able to pick this up and run with it when whoever's sponsoring it or initiates it is gone? And that's always been a challenge. The good news, I can look back in the 8 countries that I was stationed in Africa, and many of the programs that we started continue to this day, which is with good results. And just continuing as a success, but good results. And that's very encouraging, particularly the counseling and testing you saw in Botswana with Tabela Pele. Tabela Pele itself ran into a bit of a little headwind. They had some problems with some people that administer the program, but the concept and the services are still there, and they changed the culture. That's what's so fascinating about Tabela Pele, Gail, is that they changed the culture. Before Tabela Pele, and almost single-handedly, that organization changed culture in Botswana so that not only was it okay to know your status, but it was cool to go get tested. I mean, yeah. I knew this one guy, young man, university graduate in Botswana, who would go get tested all the time, and he was a virgin. He never had sex, but he just went and got tested all the time because it became, it was like the thing to do. And every few months he went and got tested, even though he wasn't having sex, So, yeah, but I mean, that's how inculcated it became, how much it became a norm in society, when just a few short years before, my goodness, you didn't talk about HIV, you didn't tell anybody. And and the serious thing about a disease like HIV is that most people are not symptomatic because they have the virus, but they're not ill, and they can transmit it. And and so for years you could transmit it to partners, even though it's not easy to transmit, without even knowing about it. If you don't know your status, you don't know that you have a responsibility to protect yourself and others. And so that was really a earth-shattering or culture-changing event. And covering that, I wrote about it before you came down, and then you did the Promise of AFRICOM. And I thought that was a really nice piece in what you did, because that program we did, the Promise of AFRICOM, you started with an exercise, a multilateral exercise in Uganda. And which is really cool, by the way, the ended because they're singing in Swahili. That's a nice way to end that program. That was brilliant. I got to give you kudos for that. The whole program was great. And not just because I was in it. No, but but you had that. You interviewed General Ward. You talked to a lot of key people. You talked to my boss, Ambassador Nolan, there in Botswana. I remember you and I chatted. He seemed a bit nervous and stiff that day when he started. I hope he calmed down as you went through the conversation, because I can only see the part that you put in the video. But that was a fascinating program, and you were doing that out of Atlanta, I think, at the time. That wasn't from Europe, right?
That was from Atlanta, yes. Yeah, I came back and edited everything together from there. And part of that program, I went into Kenya, where the CDC had some of the initial clinics in trying to discover cures for HIV. And so that was also part of that story. And that worked really well. And then when you talk about programs that have had a success, when I went to West Africa, the CDC discovered that some of the initiatives that they had brought over to establish public health regimens, policies, practices, procedures had actually become a full-blown national bureau. So it had been adopted. And so they were now collecting data. They were now monitoring people. They were watching the borders, because those borders between those countries are very porous. And they were keeping track on people who turned up sick and tracked back, where did the sickness come from? Who did they talk to? And so that was a very good, successful program. It was a horrible, horrible epidemic, and it took a lot of lives. But in the aftermath, we are actually seeing strong national public health monitoring systems be set up in place. And we care because people travel.
Oh, absolutely.
And if they...
a pathogen can be anywhere on the planet within 24 hours, literally.
Absolutely.
Literally.
Absolutely.
You know, it's here's a little war story to add on to that. Talk about seeing success stories. So when Africa Command first stood up, and you're probably familiar with some of this, if not all of it, but I'll share it for the audience and maybe for you as well. When AFRICOM stood up, they got funding for something. They put together a proposal called the Pandemic Response Program. And
I remember that.
Okay. The concept on Eric Threet was a lieutenant commander of the Navy, and he was responsible for administering the program in Stuttgart. And of course, you know me, I'm very aggressive at trying to get resources and help get solutions. And I saw this, I'm like, hey, this looks good. So each country I went to, I always advocated and encouraged them to be part of it. Now, I had nothing to do with Nigeria's participation, but this is about Nigeria specifically in the program. So this program would host conferences in Africa, in Italy, even in Bangkok. They went one time for this, and it would bring military health professionals and civilians from ministries of health together to talk about response and contact tracing, isolation, quarantining, all these different programs, the treatments, that sort of thing. And so they did this for a number of years when Africa Command first stood up. I don't know if the program eventually went away. I think it may not be there anymore. But the end result of this is a good news story, is that these militaries and civilian health ministries that participate in this, some of them took it very seriously. They took it very seriously. They said, this is a nice concept. We like this idea. And by the way, this is ironic in the age we're dealing with now, is how we helped African countries develop a very effective pandemic response program. But anyway, and I'll leave that there on the table. But anyway, so what happened, the Nigerians were very eager for this. When the Mono River region Ebola outbreak took place in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone in 2013, 2014, there was someone or a couple people who came from Liberia to Nigeria on a flight and brought Ebola there. Mm-hmm. The Nigerian Ministry of Health, this is a story that's not talked about. When people talk about it, the U.S. government and the U.S. Army likes to crow, well, we stopped Ebola. Now, the $1 billion we spent in Liberia primarily had an impact, but the real change was the cultural change and local community volunteers who made the difference on the ground. People who changed behavior, people who stood up as leaders, people who weren't even employed, young women, young men, middle-aged, older people. Hey, look, someone's got to do something. They stepped forward at a critical time. All the rest of the stuff played a role, but that was the key game changer that stopped it in its tracks eventually. But anyway, we spent $1 billion there, so we like to pat ourselves on the back and say we did a great job. We did have an impact, but let's be honest. But in Nigeria, what happens? This could have been a disaster. 200 million people. I mean, someone lands in Lagos and, 16 million people around Lagos. But what happened is the Nigerians were already aware of it because the alert had been sounded previously by Médecins Sans Frontières earlier that year. And so they were paying attention to the health alerts. And what they did is when they had someone show up that got sick, they immediately descended, figured out what it was, quickly isolated that person, quarantined them, did immediate contact tracing, and they wound up limiting the Ebola that came from the Mono River region into the densely populated Nigeria, the most populated country in Africa, to just 21 cases, I think it was. I think one or two may have passed away. But my point is that was an outgrowth of an activity that someone initiated, U.S. Africa Command, and people say, what can Africa Command do? And you talk about the promise of Africa Command. Without that program, I wonder if Nigeria would have responded in the same fashion, because they didn't have a pre-existing program that addressed things the way they eventually did that in 2014 for an activity that started back in 2007. And I think that's, when people ask about the military, I always, I don't get a kick, but I kind of chuckle when people look at us in uniform and they're frightened. I appreciate where people are coming from, but professional military is responsible for ensuring people's safety and defending them. And you do as little harm as possible. And that's your role. And we do a lot of things, around the world that make a big impact that's positive. And I got very fortunate to be a part of many of those things, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. We did things with communities. And so for me, it was very fulfilling, and I really enjoyed it. But I thought you might enjoy that story. That's a success story for AFRICOM that would make a good story someday for somebody to write about.
In my 30 years of working with the military, I came quickly to realize that in most of the places where we put boots on the ground, the first impression that the local population has of America is the military. And in that case, they become frontline ambassadors. And most of them are incredibly awesome people who want nothing more than to say hi. How's your home? Here's my home. Do you have children? How can I help you? And that is, I think, the imprint of the U.S. military around the world. I think that is the strongest imprint. Yes, you have wars. Yes, you have combat. But even in those situations, you're going to have combat soldiers who are going to step forward and say, how can I help? And I think that is the America that I am so very proud of. Absolutely.
Well, I'm with you 100% on that. Obviously, once again, exposing my bias. I'm from inside the wire, definitely 36 and a half years in the Army, 34 active duty, 23 overseas. Clearly, I'm inside the wire and biased, but I think we agree 100% on that. Gail, we could talk for hours, I suspect, here, but you've been very generous with your time. But before we go, I'd like to do a couple things, if you don't mind, if you can indulge me. I'd like to ask you about this Creative Media Matters, the organization, this company that you started. What exactly do you do? Is this a coaching thing? Do you do video productions for people? Is it freelance work? What's it all about so people can learn? The links, by the way, to your website and your Facebook page are below this video description if anybody wants to check it out. But please, Gail, could you tell us a little bit about Creative Media Matters so that give you a chance to share that with folks?
All those points that you mentioned, yes.
Well, I did my research well.
You did your research. My goal is to help people tell their stories. And through telling their stories, they tell their goals, their missions, their objectives. So I have worked a lot lately with global public health, both at CDC. I'm currently working with Emory University, their Global Health Institute. And I've helped companies set up and do little stories about what they're doing and how they can reach people and make a difference. I do a lot of pro bono work with veterans still these days. Here in Atlanta, we have a great association called Vetlanta, which is all about helping transitioning veterans to their families to make that move from in uniform to out of uniform. And that's my goal, is to help tell the stories. And if I don't get paid and it's a good story, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyhow, because it's a good story. In Tanzania, I ran across a lady who runs a nonprofit for women who suffer a disease that happens to them when they give birth in rural situations. And there's only one surgeon in the whole country that can help repair it. And if they don't get it repaired, they get diseased, they get cast out of their village and out of their family. And this organization will bring the women in, teach them skills, help them to regain their confidence, get healthy, and then they'll send them home and tell them, so they can tell the village that it wasn't the devil that did it, it was just health. I have worked with veterans here who are trying to help other veterans recognize that suicide is not the only answer that's out there. And so Creative Media Matters is applying a creative media approach to stories. I've also done a lot of media broadcast training. I worked on various campaigns to help people realize that the value of video. And as we were talking about earlier, all the different elements that go into it. Why should we care? How can we hear what we're seeing? What's the point? What are your messages? And so I like to stay involved. You know, I'm still wondering why.
You're still Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
As your husband says. I think it's a great description of you. Well, Gail, you know, for me, your voice is instantly recognizable, and it'll always be.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. No, I say it's a golden voice. I really enjoyed your work you did with AFN. And then the reports I saw coming out, however they're distributed. I think AFRTS played a role in some of the things, distributing some of your production later on. Really good stuff. I also really enjoyed working with you, or for you, I suppose, since I was the person we interviewed with the Promise of AFRICOM, which was really cool. I still show that video to people all the time when I try to explain to them the role of what AFRICOM can be and what it is and what it isn't, which plays a big role. That's interesting about your organization. That's fantastic what you're doing. I usually wrap up the program by giving my guests an opportunity to talk about anything they like to, or just, some people it's about talking about a message of hope or some project they're working on, or just general thoughts. And you kind of wrapped up there, but let me give you one more bite at the apple here about, I don't know, maybe about journalism or about the future or anything you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up. And then I'll close it up. And if I could ask you to hold around for a couple of minutes while I finish the show, and then just so I can chat with you still on Zoom afterwards, if that's okay.
Sure. So journalism still exists. The journalism that I grew up with, that you grew up with, the Walter Cronkites, the Dan Rathers, the Tom Brokaws, quality journalism still exists. And I think that the news organizations out there are beginning to recognize that there is a need for that. People are crying out for more insight into the big stories. I think telling people's stories is important because if we listen to people's stories, then we understand our place on the planet and how we make an impact and how the lessons that they learned, we could actually benefit from those lessons. And I invite anybody to reach out. Give me a call, tap on me if you think you got a story that needs telling. I like telling stories. Sometimes I make an income at it. Sometimes I don't. But the bottom line is I like telling stories. So let's get your story out there. If I can't do it, I'll turn you back to Chris.
Oh, so I get second bite of the apple. Okay. Well, I'm like yesterday's lunch to throw me out with the fish with the paper. But no, that's fantastic, Gail. It's I get to Atlanta a couple of times a year, and it's the same kind of situation for you. When it comes to journalism, some of the stories I do, most of what I do, I don't get paid for it because I'm not doing it for fame or for pay. It's a labor of love because fortunately I've got a couple shekels in the bank. I'm not starving, so I have the flexibility to do this. But I get to Atlanta to cover Rugby ATL, the Rugby Atlanta team. I don't know if you do sports anymore. It was a long time ago, but you might look into the Rugby Atlanta team in Major League Rugby and do a story on those guys. But I go down there to cover games a couple times a season, so maybe we could grab lunch or something when I come down there. That'd be nice. If you
Absolutely. That'd be cool.
So I'll be coming down there at some point this season. I'm still working out my schedule because this year I'm expanding. Last year I went to New York, to DC, Atlanta for games. This year I'm going to add Dallas and Utah in there, and that's all at my own expense, just to promote the game of rugby and get the word out there. But labor of love. But yeah, so I'll be coming down to Atlanta, and maybe we can link up. That'd be great. Anyway, Gail McCabe, a Hall of Fame, Department of Defense, Public Affairs Hall of Famer there. It's a pleasure to have you on, Gail. It's a real pleasure to actually turn the microphone around and get to ask you questions. It was nice. Thanks for coming on. And you have an open invitation to come back anytime you like. And if I come up with anything I think might be of interesting that you might want to cover, I'll be happy to share that with you as well.
I appreciate that. And it was good talking to you. And thanks for taking me back through some of my history. And there's a whole lot more to cover.
Oh yeah, no, that's why we could talk about this again, and you talk about some colleagues there, Charlie Gill and a few others you mentioned there. Those are names, and I was like, whoa, I remember those names. That's been a few days ago. But Gail McCabe, ladies and gentlemen, Gail, I'm going to put you in the waiting room and just hang around for a minute while I wrap up the broadcast, and I'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Gail McCabe in Atlanta. Thank you so much, Gail. Okay, let me put her in the waiting room, and then we will wrap up this session here. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to smash the like button. It doesn't cost you anything but a moment of your time right below the video. Appreciate your support for Chris White Africa. I hope you found this stream to be interesting. I think that's 2 knockout guests in a row. Right, yesterday, Lord Duncan McNair on the program, human rights campaigner, former member of the House of Lords, and today, Gail McCabe, an acclaimed journalist who has been there and done that. Amazing lady. I hope you enjoyed that. Be sure to smash the like button. I'll be back in 15 minutes at the bottom of the hour for Indaba African News of the Day. Thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you then. Cheers. Be safe out there, and take care of yourselves.